the Council of Michigan Foundations is my base organization for relationship here, and that started, as you know, 40 years ago. But prior to that, about 2 years probably in the making in terms of having, I would say, representation from various areas of the state of Michigan from foundation people, of representation of foundation people who were really responding to the Tax Reform Act of 1969. And that was a wake-up call for foundations where the federal government, names like Wright-Patman and a few others come to mind, where there were some blatant abuses of foundations' abilities with their funds that were made public. And that prompted further talk and change of rules, which could have increased taxation, could have eliminated foundations at the end of that road if it were left to go. But there were folks here in Michigan who saw that quite clearly, and I would have to acknowledge the Kellogg's Foundation role in that, and Leonard White and Russ Mobby, who we've talked about a bit ago. And Leonard was really the person to try and find people in the foundation world who could get together with some sense of common purpose. So I simply happened to be at the right place at the right time. I was with a small foundation in Flint called the DeWatters Charitable Trust. Enos DeWatters, you've never heard of, but he was the second chief engineer of the Buick Motor Car Company, and he made a good deal of money based on General Motors stock and things like that. Had no children, and he and his wife gave virtually all their money to charity, either during their lifetimes or afterwards. So I was called upon to manage that. And also another, the Mallory Charitable Trust. Nobody ever heard of Harvey J. Mallory, but he was the chief accountant for Buick, and he also participated in a great stock program that General Motors had at that time. So my inclusion in terms of the early days of the Council of Michigan Foundations, I think was probably related to being from Flint, Michigan, being involved in philanthropy, and Leonard and Russ Mobby knowing that these factors throughout the state had to move forward if we were going to speak with any sort of a common voice. And so that's been my role. Number one, I was flattered to be invited. I was literally a new kid on the block at that time. And of course, the large foundation in Flint was the Mott Foundation, as it continues to be. And they, of course, came into the Council of Michigan Foundation, but were not there as an initial part of it. So I think it was a sort of a getting to know you, I mean, who are these people? Who is Alpena, Michigan? Who is Grand Rapids? Who is Detroit? And all these sorts of things. And when there was enough common denominator, there was a comfort level, as I recall, that was reached in terms of continuing on and discussing other possibilities. I recall through that process, and it wasn't earlier on, but to me, I think it was important. It came up for discussion as to whether whatever it would be called, the Council of Michigan Foundations, should be organized on a regional basis. In other words, Flint and counties, Detroit, Grand Rapids, and so forth. And it was obviously not done. And I think with good reason, because I believe the reticence on the part of some foundations to become involved with the discussions and the process was probably some question as to whether there would be any giving away of their ability to make their own grants. I mean, these were all individualists. You look at the Dow family, the Mott family, Kellogg, down on Kresge, Sebastian Kresge, so on down the line. These were people, Skillman and their families, that came up making decisions on their own and Charles Stewart Mott felt very strongly about making his own decisions. And so when it became apparent that the organization was not out to try to tell other foundations how to make their grants, that was never the intent. I think there was a sigh of relief and a willingness to continue on in that regard. Had it gone to some regional collective, if you would, it would increase the potential for that decision-making process to be different. So I knew Harding Mott well, and when I was head of the Ruth Mott Fund, he was on my board. He was actually Mrs. Mott's son-in-law, same age as Mrs. Mott. Mrs. Mott was Mr. C.S. Mott's fourth husband. Harding was a child of fourth wife, excuse me. Harding was a child of the first marriage of C.S. Mott. So I knew them both, and Stanley Kresge, and I'll relate a story that I previously related, one of my memories, and probably it would not have done much good for me to have a recording, but I found myself for lunch at one of these meetings seated between Stanley Kresge and the senior David Hunting, which is Steelcase. And out of Grand Rapids, here's Detroit. I'm not sure if the gentlemen had ever talked with each other or met each other before, but both, on in years at that point in time. And I was seated between them, and I remember saying, well, if you would like to sit next to each other, I'll move. Oh, no, you can sit there. And so here I am listening to this over lunch, this discussion of two real giants in philanthropy, coming from different locations, but you could see the mutual respect that I remember. And that to me was somewhat illustrative of what CMF has done and allowed to happen, and that is to have people who might never have been seated at the same table, which is what our luncheon was in good part about today, be seated at the same table and find there are common denominators. No one was threatening one another. And so that stands to me as one of those being in the right place at the right time. The initial purpose was to speak as a single voice in terms of potential legislation, potential increased taxation, and things like that, and to see it expand to how many people are here? 750. To see it expand to this, now inclusive of other nonprofits and things of that nature. I can't imagine that would have been a vision of hardly anyone at that point in time. I had had experience in business, and I had had brief experience in managing a tax-exempt organization. The DeWatters Charitable Trust had a fixed life. They had to distribute everything within 25 years after the death of the donor, which was patterned after a Detroit trust. I think it was the Cousins Trust, and they said basically, spend it in 25 years and then let somebody else do the work. So at any rate, they were faced after several years with more money than they knew they had. And they were looking for somebody, because this was run by Michigan National Bank at that time, looking for somebody who had some business experience and knew something about the community. Well, I happened to be there, and it looked like an interesting place to go. So that's what I did. There's a phrase, and maybe I'm going to it a little too quickly, but I think it perhaps is illustrative of the attitude of the leadership in the foundation area in Michigan. When I first went into philanthropy with the DeWatters Trust, Mr. DeWatters used the phrase in some giving, There's a dormitory named after he and his wife at Kalamazoo. There's a DeWaters Arts Center in Flint. And I read the old newspaper articles, and he said he considered philanthropy to be a rare privilege. 2 words. In other words, he had no idea that he would have the wherewithal. And he knew that it was indeed rare and indeed a privilege to be able to do that. And the converse of that is people getting into themselves a little too much because they do have the wherewithal or access to the wherewithal to make changes and maybe get a little too bludgeoning along the way. That's not the word I would have hoped to use, but getting a little bit too forward and never getting above their grantees, never getting, above their peers and things of that nature. So, and I wouldn't just use that to describe them. I've seen a good deal of that with CMF leadership in one form or another. I've seen a little bit of the other side of it, not much. But mostly people don't get out of themselves, we'll put it that way. They don't become blatant. They don't become bruising in their grant making or anything like that. Russ and Dottie were exactly like that. They're quite willing to give credit to somebody else. And so I think that as an attitude would have been a factor, and one that I believe continues now. I really do. I haven't found a better phrase, and I've worked for foundations. I've been on foundation boards and things like that, but it's not my family that these funds came from. And I think, and I hope that has been a bit of a guidance for me along the years too. It's a rare privilege to be able to do that. Early on, I believe, to Washington once. I haven't been on regularly the Washington trips. I've been able to have some contact with local politicians. Whether it's been helpful or not, I don't know. I know public policy was important, it continues to be important, but I haven't been as active in the public policy issues as thankfully many have. Way back when, primarily because of the Mott Foundation, legislators were generally aware that philanthropy had been pretty important in the Flint, Michigan area. They look at the community school concept, they look at everything like that, and they knew where that came from. And so I would say they were aware, but I think it was important to remind them that the Mott Foundation wasn't the only kid on the block. I mean, there were other good things happening through other foundations in that area, that region. And so I believe that may have been helpful, just making sure they had annual reports in front of them. And thought you'd be interested, Mr. Senator, and Representative, and so forth. Not unlike the Dow people in Midland. I mean, you look at all the families, the Strosackers, the Gerstackers, Bob Allen, in addition to the Dows and the various branches there. And the short answer is it really spewed out. Now, let me first go back to the DeWaters Trust. I seem to be going back to that more than I thought I might, but we had the latitude as a private foundation to, I don't want this to be put negatively, not be encumbered by, say, political processes and things of that nature. We had a very good scholarship fund, which brought other money into in this case, the Flint Board of Education, which was, I believe, very helpful and significant. We had another project, I recall, that basically was, give me a second, I'll tell you the name of it. Anyway, mini grant program to teachers, not circumvented in that sense, but went directly to teachers and said, you have a little project in your classroom that might be $1,000 or $2 that you would like to have support for. We got a wealth of requests, and we made these grants, and that sprung forth, to other things that may have been expanded in the school system. A third one there, the biggest grant we made was at the time the University of Michigan was contemplating moving its campus to downtown Flint. And they had to go through, of course, the political process, they being the U of M. Mott Foundation had not made a commitment to it. We made a commitment for $1 million and said, this was huge for us. This was way out of our realm, but we thought it was important enough to do that. And we put that on the table. And when they talked to some local legislators, and then the Mott Foundation came in shortly thereafter. I doubt that we prompted it, but we eased the path just a little bit with that one. The Welch Foundation, which I've been on too long, will be leaving next year. Yeah, finally. And we have the goal of supporting projects for young people, programs for young people that might not be available through the regular course of events or whatever. We've supported for a number of years, for instance, the Flint, which is now a regional science fair, allowing young people the opportunity to participate not only locally, but at an international level with science projects. We continue to support that. We have supported a program for young people with the Flint Institute of Music, which has grown into one of the largest in the United States in terms of participation. And that might be teaching lessons, that might be whatever. But it's been gratifying to see the expansion, not that we have stopped supporting it, but that more support has come in from other directions, somewhat as a result of maybe what we did. But so there would be a couple examples of those sorts of things. I think probably the reason for it is the success that's been enjoyed here locally, or a factor. And it might be Dottie Johnson or Rob Collier saying, look, we've done all this. We can be helpful by expanding what we've done and so forth. So and that ultimately goes back to the board, because ultimately it's a board decision as to whether you're going to go forward with that. But I do think the successes that were realized, over the years, not necessarily just early years, but over the years, can prompt that sort of activity. And probably Rob or Dottie might have had $1 in their pocket that maybe would help that process along from some foundation that thinks like them or whatever. So that's what I would say. You build on your successes and expand from that point. We've got to think out of the box, right? Right. This might not have much to do with philanthropy, but it does in a sense. I was invited as a member of as the executive director of the Ruth Mott Fund to attend a session at Ann Arbor, which President Ford and President Carter cooperated on after their terms were through. And they would meet in alternate years. Down at Emory University, they'd meet for President Carter in Ann Arbor, and they would discuss international issues. The Ruth Mott Fund was involved at that point with international security as one of its programs. So that allowed me to get out of the house and go to various places in the country. It was very interesting. Great growth period for me personally. And at any rate, I was queued up for this breakfast. And I turned around, and behind me is President Ford. And I said, President Ford, welcome back to Michigan. Oh, he said, how wonderful. I told him I was from Flint and Ruth Mott Fund and so forth. He said, well, let's sit down together. He said, I want to talk about Michigan. Now, here were all these Zygmunt Brzezinski and you name it, people wanting to get on his elbow, and he wanted to sit down and talk about Michigan. We talked in large measure about environment. And his parting shot, which is still applicable today, he said, you know, Michigan would do well if academia in the state would get together and work hard on finding a solution to desalinating the ocean's water. Now, we're not 1,000 miles from an ocean, but his desire to protect the integrity of the Great Lakes was clear at that point in time. And that continues to stick with me. And would it be a worthy project for Michigan universities, academia to cooperate on, to try and do that to protect the Great Lakes? Not that it is not important to keep carp out of the lakes or, you know, things of that nature. I'm not demeaning that, but he was really thinking about the integrity of our water supply. Let me tell you another story, and it introduced me to a bigger world of philanthropy. It was my first trip to New York City after I was with the Ruth Mott Fund. And I flew in on a Monday morning. It was 1980, so it was almost to the day 32 years ago. 32. Yeah, 1980. At any rate, I arrive in New York City. I take a taxi to the hotel I was staying. And I unpack and I walk to every place in New York I wanted to visit. I started then and did that ever since. And I was walking down Central Park South, and there was this commotion ahead of me. So I stop, and out of this hotel comes Luciano Pavarotti, dressed as Christopher Columbus, and there's this steed, the biggest horse I'd ever seen. It's Columbus Day, and he is Grand Marshal of the Columbus Day Parade in New York City. And so I wait for the pass, and his entourage, he mounts his horse, has 3 steps to go up this platform. Great big guy, big plumed hat, dressed like Christopher Columbus. I said, whoa. And so I go on, and of course, there is this parade that was forming, and I hear these sirens. And I look, and here comes a couple cops in a limousine with the window open. And this fellow waving, it's President Carter, who was running for re-election in 1980, defeated by Ronald Reagan. And here, before noon in New York City, I see Luciano Pavarotti and the President of the United States. I said, Jim, this is pretty good. I said, this sort of works. Now, that has very little to do with philanthropy, but I went on to make visits to other foundations and things like that. Well, I've had the privilege of having some wonderful board members, and it's the people who count in the final analysis. Helen Milliken was on my board. Norman Cousins, head of Saturday Review, and advisor to presidents and things of that nature, plus members of the Mott family, and this goes on. My gracious George Woodwell from Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and that, I mentioned briefly, that was a period of great growth for me, and in large measure because of the board that I was able to work with. Number one, I think it's important, and it was pointed up today, to be active in wherever you are in a volunteer community. As a volunteer, before I got hired, in philanthropy, I was on boards with automobile executives. I was on boards with community service people. I was on board with bankers. I was on board with you name it. And I would still suggest that as a starting point that may lead to something in philanthropy. If you're in the right place at the right time and you get lucky and things like that. So that's where I would start. I was raised in a small town in Ohio about 1,700 people. My graduating class was 25. I went to school, graduated with a degree in business. I think the early service, you can't ignore the church. And the founders of our Constitution and our country did not ignore the church either. That's why we're here, because of this sector which is not governmental and not business. And the church was the start of that. So you learn to give a dime at church. You learn to share a little bit there. And you might be put on, not what's on a committee, but you might be asked for advice along the way. So that, I'm sure, was a factor in my upbringing. My mother, I have a brother who's still alive, 62, severely retarded and handicapped. She did everything, including building a building for them. I mean, didn't pay for it, but she was out hustling other people to help with that process to do something better for my brother Joe. That I look back on as clearly a factor. My father too, but my mother was really he was out trying to make money, and Mom really worked hard at that and with good results. So I suspect that's all a part of it. And then to get involved, this may seem almost an aside, but I raised in a small town. Big cities scared me. Colleges scared me. After I got to Flint, Michigan, I was able to put aside my fear of being in front of a group of people. Toastmasters in this case. It could be something else for somebody else. Didn't learn it in college, and came to that, and that led to more volunteerism, and then for whatever route it took. But I've run the DeWaters Charitable Trust, the Mallory Charitable Trust, the Ruth Mott Fund. I'm still on the board of the Welch Foundation after these many years. I was on the board of the YWCA Foundation, on the board of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint, its predecessor, which was the Flint Area Health Foundation. I was on that board and helped with the merger of two groups, which formed the Community Foundation. So one thing seemed to lead to another, and a lot of them were obviously related to foundations and philanthropy. Yeah, let me talk about the kids a little bit. My son is a sound engineer and sound designer. He's independent now. He travels all over. He's down outside of Atlanta. He worked for their cultural center, or their Alliance Theater company, for a lot of years, and was in charge of 3 theaters there as far as the sound is concerned. Because of his traveling, he doesn't volunteer as much as my other 2 children, but he probably volunteers more than I'm aware in one form or another, giving his services or something of that nature. He's quite busy at this point. My daughter Susan is in Hayward, Wisconsin. She's master's degree, social work and psychology. She's a counselor, deals mostly with substance abuse, drug abuse issues. Has her own business now, which she started up. She volunteers regularly, somewhat not in the same political thinking that I do, but she is a volunteer and across the board there. My youngest child, Melissa, is in Flint. She's Down syndrome. She's 42. She works 2 days a week, or part of 2 days, at the YWCA. She volunteers 2 days a week at the public library. So volunteer has been a part of her life too. So in that sense, the importance of giving time, I think, has been in the family, is in the family, we'll put it that way.
What a great story. It's so meaningful for you and for her to give service like that.
Well, it meant a lot to me, at the outset. I'm cutting back now on volunteer commitments, and I'll give you this list, and this goes back a ways, but it's that long, you know, and so it's somebody else's turn. That's all that's to it. So, yeah.
And we all are in the process of turning it over, I think, to the next generation.
I think we've got to. That's all that's to it. It has to happen. I just can't get away from the importance of the people, the quality of the people, and the importance of sitting at a table like today. I went to a table again. I said, I want to sit at a table where I don't know anybody. And I did. And it's through that process and meeting some really, really big individuals over these decades, which I think continues to be important. And as we get more, I don't know the right word, it's not inundated, as we get more taken in to the technology, the potential for that contact, I believe, may decrease. I mean, Twitter, you know, I can stay in my room and get all the information I want and so forth. But the importance of what this conference has done as one of the ways of sitting at a table with a variety of people, I met some great people today, I think to be important in the fundamental precept that it's the people who count. I mean, it's the people who count, be them grantees, be them fellow trustees, be them whoever, but it is the people who count. So that I would emphasize.